Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Soft Landing Podcast, a gentle space for self-discovery. This week, we're cracking the code of safe sex practices. So we've doubled the pleasure of this episode by having two dope guests to chat with us about safer sex and pleasure. Our first guest is Mystkue Woods. Mystique, using she, her pronouns, is a certified sexologist and sexuality arts educator, specializing in integrating expressive art modalities such as poetry, dance, music, drama, aka theater, storytelling, and creative movement to promote positive attitudes towards sexual and reproductive wellness across cultures and communities. Mystique is also a published author, poet, and content creator. She loves creating work that encapsulates the BIPOC identities and their experiences with sex, sexuality, and art. And to boot, she's a member of the Healing Exchange team as well. Welcome, Mystique.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So I have a fun question for us again this week. This came from, again, my research. And so I was just wondering, what is one aspect of safer sex you've heard about that, really made it sexy for you?
I think it's about building confidence. I think for me, that is the most important because sex is funny and awkward and all of those things. And so oftentimes we feel the need to perform. But if we just relax and, just relish in who we are, then we can just be so much more confident.
I dig that.
Bring the fun into it.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so much pressure with sex. And then with a topic like safer sex, just thinking about the fear tactics that are usually used and all of the pictures we used to be shown that were just like, your genitals are going to look like this, or this terrible thing is going to happen to you. That was so scary and intimidating. So I love the reminder of incorporating it in a fun way. And I love that question of like, what's a sexy way or a fun way to have this conversation?
Absolutely.
What about you? Do you have something?
Yeah, I do have an example specifically from my research that I thought was really fun. So I'm going to read the description and then I want y'all to guess like what is in reference to.
Okay.
Okay. It's small, convenient. You can carry it in your bag. Inserted by yourself or your partner can help. It's nicely lubricated. It comes with 2 rings. One anchors against the cervix, and this outer ring is the secret. When a penis or a dildo goes into your vagina, the outer ring is pressing against the clitoris. That's what really does it.
It sounds like a vaginal sex toy or like a panty vibrator with a cock ring attachment.
Yeah, those both sound lovely.
I was thinking, first, before you got to the part about a dildo or penis can go inside, I was thinking it was some type of insertable toy that maybe has ringlets on it. But now I'm thrown for a loop and I don't know.
I was too. I was very surprised when reading the description and what it turned out to be. And she was talking about an internal condom. Yeah.
Okay.
I was like, okay.
That was so sexy.
Yeah, it sounded like a really good time, So I think, going back to what you were saying, Mystique, about building that confidence, I feel like the way she described it was like, no, like this is not only like me taking ownership of like my safety around sex, but it's also like pleasurable for me, right? Like I am finding the fun, the sexiness within this contraception that maybe others haven't. And I was like, that's really dope.
Yeah. I think it's really important to talk about the fun ways we can have this conversation, to talk about safer sex, because generally people have histories of embarrassment and shame.
Absolutely.
I remember hearing stories of folks who were intimidated or, didn't want to be in the checkout line and someone know that they have condoms. Or, it's just like, what is the shame and embarrassment there as opposed to being like, good for you for, doing the thing that feels safe for you instead of like, I need to hide this. But I do believe it comes from a fear of them having sex at all getting out. So I'm thinking of older people that I know. It's like, I can't buy condoms because such knows my mama. And then they're going to be like, do you know your kid was at the store buying condoms? So maybe it's just like residual from that.
Right.
The shame has kind of converted from fear of being found out to using them at all. I don't know. I'm taking a leap, but something like that.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's definitely a cool way of looking at it. And so I guess, starting off, Misty, do you want to maybe share a bit about how you came into this work and like why you feel it's like important to be thinking about the intersection of like safer sex and pleasure?
Yeah, so I came into this work maybe about 7 years or so ago. And it was really about finding a way to center my own experiences, but specifically, what does that look like for a 14 or 15-year-old person in the inner city? I remember growing up and feeling like I didn't have no one to talk to that wasn't trying to fear monger me into not experiencing any type of pleasure or understanding like what sex was in its entirety. And so, in moving into the space, it was really about how do I speak to little Mystique?
I feel like I also feel the same way, and I feel like a lot of people do, of like that inner child that we're all just trying to nurture, particularly around this work. So I definitely feel connected to that. Like on the opposite side, I grew up in a small rural town, so but still very much so the same issues. Yeah.
I feel like it's very common when you talk to sexuality educators, they are perceived as the folks who are really open and kinky and talking about all of the new things that you can do with sex and how to increase pleasure using toys and positions and things like that. So I'm a little bit more curious about how you've come to specialize in pleasure and safer sex specifically, and centering that is really different than the safer sex that is more on the fear-mongering side. So could you speak to why it was important for you to do this type of work specifically?
So I was saying that my experiences are really what kind of honed it in for me, but unfortunately, I have been an individual who has experienced things like stealthing, which is, when someone takes a condom off without knowing. And so having this idea or fear, and also not being educated enough around, what happens or how do you communicate about potentially contracting an STI or an STD and what does that look like? And how do you also take care of yourself is really what has pushed me into finding pleasure in saying like, hey, you know what? I know that I really want to have sex with you, but I know that I also really want to be intentional about my safety and my health and taking onus in that. And I think that oftentimes when we think about pleasure, it's like, oh, it's not good unless it's raw. But in reality, we also have to think about what that looks like on an entire spectrum of what comes with that responsibility of having unprotected sex. And so I think that when we talk about pleasure, we can talk about, yes, it feels good, but how can we also make this internal condom sexy or this external condom sexy or using lube and using that to massage your genitals and make sure that you're fully aroused or whatever the case may be, because usually we just talk about it from a clinical perspective, and sometimes unless you're really a person that's like into that type of setting, it's boring, right? And so it doesn't seem fun, it doesn't seem sexy, but there's so many different ways in which that you can make it beautiful and pleasurable to you and your partner, as long as you tap into what it is that they find sexy about it.
Yeah. Really being able to center your pleasure around the conversation and prioritize that is so fundamental. And I'm thinking about, I love that you mentioned using lube, because growing up, the message is condoms are uncomfortable and it's too tight and it's too this. And I can't feel anything. And sometimes that being used to coerce the other partner or to make them just feel like bad.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are undereducated about what type of condom to use, what size to have, being able to use lube inside, outside, all of these other aspects or components that can really increase the pleasure when using an external condom specifically. And people just need, one, that information, but also the skills to be able to have that conversation and advocate for themselves. And another thing that you brought up, Mystique, was stealthing. And again, as you said, that is when someone non-consensually removes a condom when the partner that they are having sex with is under the impression that they are using it and would continue using it during the entirety of the sexual experience. And so I did just want to go back to let people know or remind folks that that is not okay, and it is sexual assault. And I'm thinking about the show, I think it's called I Might Destroy You, or something.
I May Destroy You.
I May Destroy You.
Yes.
Where there is several episodes that centered on the main character's experience of being stealth and, you know, the outcome of that. But I remember during those episodes being released, there were so many different conversations about that behavior and realizations that victims experienced.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wow. One, didn't know that. I felt strongly about it and I felt violated, but I wasn't really sure why. And so this is why it's so important to have these conversations so that we can put a name to an experience, but also have that validation of, yeah, that really didn't sit right with me, but maybe that person did a little gaslighting or minimizing, or it's not that big of a deal, or aren't you on birth control anyway? Like, what's the problem? And being able to advocate for and validate people's desires and preferences around their sexual health. And I've often heard people use the fact that maybe they've already been tested and, you know, I don't have an STI, so what's the big deal? And aren't you on birth control? Where it's like, that's not the only concern that I have. And it's not up to you to make that choice for me. And, you know, I do want to take a moment to just acknowledge that I did use the term victim when talking about stealthing. And that is because I really feel it is important to use both when you can, but definitely use victim, because to me, it really hones the idea and the fact that a crime took place. It really makes it clear that this was not an interpersonal wrongdoing, right, between two people, that this is illegal or assault, and so therefore it is a crime, and you are a victim of the crime. I think so often in our society, we have terms like playing the victim and making people feel like they can't use that language because it's minimized. But please keep in mind that that term indicates something happened that was not right and is a crime, and it is okay to say that you are a victim of something happening to you without it meaning you're playing victim or someone else has the right to minimize your experience because of that.
Absolutely.
With that, I would love for us to also I love like ground setting. So when we are talking about safer sex, what exactly do we mean when we say that?
Yeah, and why safer sex?
Right.
You know, we've all grown up for the most part hearing about safe sex.
Right.
So why safer sex, Mystique?
Yeah, so I love this question because I think that when people think of safe sex, they automatically think like, oh, well, it's either you're using condoms or you're abstinent, right? Because that's what we've been taught. But safer sex goes a little bit deeper than that because it brings in the element of being trauma informed and also acting on basically what we call nowadays like standing on business, but in the efforts of how we communicate about our needs and setting boundaries and setting expectations. So safer sex is really about establishing what is the goal at the end of this session or at the end of this time together, right? And how do we want to come out feeling not only pleasurable, but also in a space where we both have a communicable understanding of what feels good and how we want to feel in this moment, and being okay with feeling secure. Safer sex for me, in my definition, is not about anything else but just being in the moment, and it eliminates it being transactional.
And just to ride on that, I think, people still do use safe sex, and others are choosing to use safer sex, just to acknowledge that there is a risk and vulnerability that comes with sex, and there isn't anything we can do with 100% guarantee that it's going to be safe. And I really love using safer, because then it reminds me that in real time, like, okay, so what can I do to be as safe as possible while also knowing that there is a risk, and therefore I need to be even more mindful and intentional. Yeah. As opposed to just using safe sex, where it kind of gives this like cozy feeling of, safety that isn't there. Right. And so if we can remember there's always a risk, how would we respond differently? How would we set expectations and boundaries differently if we know I have to be very intentional here?
Yeah, that's a great addition, and it makes you think of, between the two of you, that piece around being in the moment with each other, right? So that you can really be able to communicate what that looks like. I think that, there's a lot of misconceptions around what that looks like and what that should be. And so I'd love for us to maybe talk about what some of those are as well.
Yeah, so I think going back to what you said about the R at the end of safer can also be like in terms of an acronym for relative and relational, right? And so oftentimes when we talk about sex, it's like, oh, like we want to make sure that we both want the same things. But when are we having these conversations? Because it's my hope that we're not having these conversations when we are in the thick of it. It should be happening before, during, and after, right? Because it allows us to set a precedent, but also to understand where it is and how things fluctuate. And also being mindful of how we feel today, and then this specific moment might not be how we feel tomorrow or the next day, or 3 or 4 years later. And so thinking about when I'm talking to my partner, when I am navigating what it is that we want these experiences to feel like, how do we relate them to what I need as an individual, and then what the other person needs or people need, and then how we all relate together.
I really love that addition.
Same. It makes you think of this idea of what you're saying of it's an ongoing conversation, it should be happening before, during, after, and then all the time after that. I think is really important, because I think sometimes there's this idea too of like, well, I learned what to do, safer sex practices, I got tested, I did that thing, we're good. And, that's not the case. Like, it should be an ongoing conversation, because, I'm thinking of married couples, honestly, and how there are people in long-term relationships who make these assumptions about their sex lives with each other. And, one of those people could be making decisions outside of that relationship. And they're not having these ongoing conversations around safer sex, which then, opens each other up to a lot more risk.
Yeah. And also, there are more reasons to want to use an internal or external condom aside from pregnancy prevention and even STI prevention. Sometimes it's about the mess.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have a partner where there are fluids and things involved, sometimes you don't want to deal with that. You want an easier cleanup process. And sometimes people just have sensitivities with their bodies. And so, I've worked with folks who experience yeast infections and BV, or just have irritation, and they struggle to talk to their partner about wanting to use some type of barrier to increase their pleasure and decrease their discomfort after having sex. But they were just like, but we're in a long-term relationship and it's going to be weird. So I would love for us to get outside of the purpose of sex is only for preventing these unwanted experiences such as pregnancy and STI prevention. But what about also preventing messy cleanup, preventing some type of discomfort because of fluids, and give people a range of reasons why it could be a good fit for them and validate that. I think another thing makes it hard in long-term relationships is because sometimes people want to be in long-term relationships so they cannot use these things. So being able to talk about people want to spice things up and they're thinking of toys and bondage. What if we just start exploring different types of condoms and that being sexy and fun as well, and being able to explore with different types of lubes and internal and external, and so it doesn't have to be using barriers are boring, and it indicates that we can have fun with it.
I definitely agree with everything you said. So yeah. You can make condom art, and we love to see it and visualize it, but what would it look like to make condom art with your bodies, right?
Well, Mystique, what is condom art? Tell us.
Yeah.
Condom art is when you take different packages of condoms and you create some type of art piece. So for example, last week I was in Baltimore at a sex ed pop-up, and they had images of condoms, and you can actually walk up to it, and it was kind of like a poster board size, and it was a bunch of different condoms, but it spelled out like consent is sexy, and it was all different condom brands. So you had internal condoms up there, external condoms. You also had like packaging of the lubes. There's also been instances where people have made like clothing out of condoms. So they've made dresses and skirts and all of that stuff, but it's just of the contents of different condoms.
That is dope. And I love that because that's still, for me, like safer sex and pleasure, right? Like we're looking at these items in a way, in a unique way that's still really pleasurable, right? Like I would never think, oh, we can use all these condoms to talk about how consent can be sexy. We can create fashion and art out of this stuff too, to show, right? Like there's so many different ways that we can interact with it that isn't limiting to just being like, oh, well, you got to use a condom to do that thing.
Yeah. I think that could be cool to, like, if there's a museum or an exhibit to go together to destigmatize sex in general, and then sex education, and being more positive about it.
But also too, in thinking about, sustainability, right? We have condoms that expire. They all expire. So if you have condoms that you're not using, this could be a cool thing that you can do with your partner. For me, I know we just passed Valentine's Day. One of the things that I like to do is create condom roses. So you just put a bunch of condoms together. You have a little pipe cleaner that is green, and then you fold the condom in a specific way so that it looks like a little rose. And then you just make a bouquet of them, and then you just pass them out to people.
Oh, that's cute. Yeah. I like that. And, if they are not expired, then that's perfect because they can take that home.
Yeah.
And pull off a condom pedal, and get to using it.
Raphael, I think you also mentioned like the piece around education. So I would love to also talk about like, how does this conversation around safer sex typically play out in sex education?
Terribly. Mystique, we can definitely hear your experience, but I'm thinking about, what people typically imagine is that not well-educated teacher who was pulled into covering this in health class or biology class, and essentially they're saying, hey, y'all, use condoms, be safe, avoid pregnancy in this way. And it's in one ear, out the other. Maybe they try to have a little fun with trying to put a condom on a banana or a cucumber. But other than that, it doesn't get deeper than that. And so let's talk about how it's played out in sex ed. And Mystique, what do you try to do in your work to add way more information so people can make an informed decision about the barriers that they want to use? And I don't know, maybe making it fun and entertaining. We love a sex edutainment.
Oh yeah. Hopefully that's what this podcast is.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm all about games. And so one of the ways that I engage my students are by using things that they already do. So usually when we talk about condoms and like what's happening in the moment, we're talking about right then and there when they are about to, their genitals are exposed, they're about to do said action. And so it's like, all right, let's take it a step back and think about the entirety of where we're coming into getting the condom, right? And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? I'm like, so like, are we picking up condoms from the gas station? Are we getting them from our doctor's offices? Like, where is it coming from? Because all of these things matter, right? Has it been sitting in your wallet for a year?
Oh, yes.
And if it has been in your wallet for a year, then what does that mean? Should this be exactly, right? Throw it away. But should you be using it? Why or why not?
Right.
And oftentimes when we start to break it down and really go into the nuances of what it is to, you know, hold a condom and have one in your possession, and for whatever your reasoning is, then they get to thinking. And so from there, it's like, all right, so walk me through the steps of like how you're about to administer this condom. And we use what we like to call, you know, the condom demonstrators or the woodies. I particularly hate them. So I actually use real dildos because I think that it's very interesting that in the sex ed space, oftentimes a lot of organizations want you to use these wooden materials as if a penis is shaped like this wooden thing, object, right? An adamant object. And so for me, oftentimes I'm like, no, we're going to use things that look and feel like the actual genitals and body parts. And so I do a relay race with them, and I'm like, all right, you have 60 seconds to administer this condom, depending on where they are in age range. So if they're like high schoolers, I'll give them 30 seconds. If they are middle schoolers, so that 5th through 8th grade, I'll give them 60 seconds. If they're adults, I'll give them like 25 seconds because, you know, adults have this thing of like, oh, I know everything. And then after they go through the relay, we then break it down. And I say, okay, so tell me all the steps that you did. 90% of them always miss the first step, which is checking the expiration date. Right. No one ever checks the expiration date. No. Usually after that, they like rip it open with their teeth. And it's like this whole conversation about why you shouldn't do that. Yes. And they're like, oh, like I never thought of it like that, or I never thought to not do these things. And it's like, yeah, because, you know, it goes to what they see on TV or what, you know, have been deemed to be cool via media and social media and all of that stuff. Right. And so from there, we really get to have like open, honest conversations about the condoms, but also too, like maybe why there is a stigma of using Magnum condoms over lifestyles. And then when I say to them, like, do you know that lifestyle makes Magnums? And like the light bulb that goes off in their head is like, what do you mean? Like, I never knew that thing. And I'm like, yeah, so you've been talking about, oh, I only use the gold pack this whole time. But in reality, you could just use a regular lifestyle and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Oh man, that was so many good stuff. That made me honestly feel like, oh my gosh, yeah.
You remember?
Yeah, I remember I had someone in my life who like was like, oh, look at me, I have a condom in my wallet. And I was like, wait a minute. First off, let's not keep it in your wallet. It's not a good idea.
It's not the type of steam you want.
Right. 2, have you checked the expiration date? No. 3, did you fold it to see if there was still air in there so it's not compromised? No. I'm going to throw that away. I'm going to go into my room and I'm going to grab you another one and show them like this is what you do, because you know that those pieces don't happen. And so I love that ability for you to like have them do it in this like fun way, but then going back to like, okay, so now let's talk about these different steps that we so often don't think about or aren't taught. And then, like you said, getting the ideas from media of how we think we should be doing it.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about, you know, right now I do want to call into the space that we are talking about penetration.
Yeah.
And so hearing these experiences, I also want to really think about how often we did not hear about queer experiences when it came to safer sex practices, because not everyone has the genitals for penetration, or sometimes they're just not interested. But there may still be a need for protective barriers based on the type of sex that they're having. And you have a bunch of people who miss out on that education because they weren't thought of during this session or during that segment of sex ed. So what can we say about that as well when we're looking at the different types of sex that people have while also being able to prioritize safer sex?
Yeah. I think the first thing is going back to what our bodies will and won't accept. And so thinking about like allergens, right? Oftentimes we don't think of that and we're just like, oh, I'm just going to grab the first condom. But if you have an individual who's allergic to latex, that's a conversation that needs to be had. I think to thinking about what different lubricants that may be inside of the condom or external lubricants that you might be using, how does that affect the body in the pH balance or the skin? Is it going to be irritated or whatever case may be, or does the skin not really care for flavored lubricant? Mm-hmm. And being able to know those things and talk about it, I think is important. And I also think thinking about moving away from just condoms itself, but what about dental dams, right? And also, what if you don't have access to a condom? How do you create these levels of protection with items in your home? Or maybe you have a condom, but you don't have a dental dam, and so you still want to practice oral sex, but you need to be able to create this thing. And so thinking about how you can do that with a condom and some scissors, if you have them in your possession.
I think that's very valuable knowledge to have, because honestly, who do you have a dental dam in the house? That usually the answer is no if you're not a sexuality educator or somebody in this field. Yeah, I have one. Yeah, I have one too. I have all the things, but this is the work that I do.
Yes.
But on average, people may not have even heard of a dental dam. Yeah. So, and they're not really, I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen one in the grocery store, in the store.
Oh, that's such a good.
Right. So where do you get them from? Yeah. The clinic, your sexual health center at school or whatever the case is. They're not readily available. So knowing that, there is a way that I can cut up this condom in order to protect genitals and my mouth, and or using specific types of saran wrap to kind of serve as a barrier is really helpful for folks who want to practice safer sex and just like, I don't have the tool, or what do I use for this? And I think that's really important. I also love that you mentioned allergens. So to me, whenever I'm talking to folks who are struggling with safer sex, I really want to know the why, right? And like the emotional aspects, but also the hands-on physical things. Is it, I experience a lot of irritation. I know folks who feel like they get drier. And so is that an allergy? Is it the lube? Like, what's going on within the body, and what could help to have a more pleasurable experience? There's also a lot of shame and embarrassment with using lube. It's like, I don't need lube, or I feel like it doesn't matter how we spend this conversation. At the end of the day, people believe what they believe, and what works for their body works for their body. But if we can just decrease the shame and embarrassment around having a bunch of different types of lube at your disposal and using them, we would be all the better for it. That's a whole other conversation.
Right.
But essentially what I'm saying is, like, what makes using whatever type of barrier feel inaccessible or uncomfortable, and then how can we make those necessary tweaks or changes so that it is more accessible and pleasurable?
I was just going to say, nobody, at least in my thought process, I think that when we think about our bodies, and I get it, everybody wants to have the WAP and all of those things, but eventually, because of friction and because of science and how it works, we all will become SpongeBob when he is not in water, So if he visits Sandy and he shrivels up, that's how our bodies and that's how our genitals will respond. I'm just saying.
So for dryness occurs.
That is such a great visual.
Right.
Oh man, no, I think that's.
You didn't have your globe, your waterfall fish tank head thing.
Oh man, that is so funny.
But I mean people have so many different experiences that they share about why they don't need lube. My concern is, I get it, sure, but when you recognize that maybe you actually do need it, are you going to be open to it? Are you going to be sitting in this message of embarrassment and shame that prevents you from doing what you need to do for your body to experience less pain? Because you've held this belief of, well, I've never needed it before. What's wrong with me that I need it now? And there's so many reasons why our bodies do what our bodies do. Sometimes we don't know. Mm-hmm. And it could be related to hormonal changes. It could be related to the type of barriers that you're using. It could just be related to where you are in your mental health and how aroused you're able to get in that moment. Maybe you need more time.
I was going to say the weather, anything. It could be related to almost anything.
Anything. Yeah. And if we already have, stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Get ready, right.
So have your assortment available so that way when you do need it, you can just easily incorporate it instead of feeling like something is wrong or broken. Bodies do what bodies do, and let's be prepared to work with it and not have all of the shame and guilt against it.
Right. And two thoughts that I had was, one, I definitely did not learn any of those type of things, like cutting up a condom, using saran wrap, even what a dental dam was, until I think undergrad, right? Like I was squarely in my 20s, and so that also speaks to like how long people go without knowing that information
and doing the things without the barriers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other piece too, like around lubrication and wetness. Also, like talking about queer sex and anal sex. The anus is not a self-lubricating thing. And I think there's this like weird belief that it is. I don't know. But it is not. And so like you need lube. You need something to help you get there. And also like being mindful of what kind of lube. I also remember years ago when I was doing some sex ed work on campus at another institution, the sexual health educator there shared with me that she had like a lot of queer men coming to her using mayonnaise as like a lubricant. Let's like not put those type of things in our bodies.
There are some things in the kitchen that you can use.
Yeah,
mayo, friends,
it's the last.
Not one
thing.
of them.
Not
last. Don't put it on at all.
Well, yeah. Sorry, you're right. Don't ever do that, please.
Don't use
it.
And I also have, people ask about using different types of oils: coconut oil, almond oil, olive. It's like, oh, it's natural.
Right.
Listen, so is poison ivy. And so sometimes I think we get hyper-focused on things being natural, so that means it's good or better for you. But people do have reactions. I do know that people use things like coconut oil as lubricant and massage oils, and that's great. But everyone's body does not respond the same way. And also, you have to remember that with those type of oils, they can be hard to clean and within the body as well. And so people do sometimes have infections because those oils can hold bacteria. So you want to be really mindful of being observant about your body and also working with things that work well for your body instead of jumping on the train. So do your research, be mindful of any reactions, and going to, your doctor if you need to make sure that everything is okay. Because I have heard some horror stories about using some of these things from the kitchen because all the blogs are talking about it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Again, media tells us certain ways of doing this.
And while we're talking about it, you cannot use oils with latex. So if you are using a latex barrier, then using any type of lube that contains oils, oil-based, will compromise the integrity of that barrier, making it ineffective. So again, do your research and making sure that all the things that you are using to be safer are actually compatible with your body and with other toys and objects that you may be incorporating as well.
Right, because, when we do that, we can then be more confident.
Yes, we can be more confident.
All right, y'all. Let's take a break here and we'll come back and finish our time with Mystique.
Did you know that Healing Exchange offers more than therapy? That's right. We also have coaches and educators on the team, and Mystique is one of them. She specializes in building healthy relationship skills, exploring kink and BDSM lifestyle, body positivity, safer sex practices, pleasure after receiving an STI diagnosis, and intimacy skills. And she does all of this within the lens of sex positivity and trauma-informed care. So if you think you are ready to build your skills when it comes to pleasure and sexuality, consider booking with Mystique today. You can learn more about her at healingexchange.com/team and clicking on her profile.
All right, and welcome back, listeners. So we've been talking about safer sex practices, mostly around contraceptives. So I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about medication that really helps us have safer sex. Particularly one that I feel like we definitely should be talking about more, which is PrEP, which stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. And so, Mystique, I was wondering if you could talk to us about what exactly is PrEP and what the purpose for it is.
Yeah, so PrEP, as you said, is pre-exposure prophylaxis. But if we break that down, what does that mean? So pre means before, exposure means coming into contact with a virus or something like that. And then prophylaxis is the preventative medication used to prevent said virus from happening. In this instance, we are talking about human immunodeficiency virus, also known as HIV. And essentially, PrEP is a daily pill that can be taken or an injectable shot that can be taken every other month after the first initial 2 shots. And it can be up to 99% effective if taken on its regimen as prescribed by your PCP.
So, when we're thinking about PrEP, really want to talk about how we can use it or how it can be seen as a way to center both pleasure and sexual health.
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about often is having a sexual health toolkit, and I think that everyone has their version of it and what that looks like. For me, sexual health toolkits really encompass how you want to feel emotionally, mental, physically, spiritually, all of those things, and what resources you need for that. And so PrEP comes into play with me because I need peace, right? And so peace means something very simple to me. So the first thing is protection. The second thing is education, right? So understanding how me taking PrEP is going to affect my body. If I am taking other vitamins, if I am taking antidepressants, or whatever the case may be. And then it is access and awareness. And so where can I go and get my PrEP? Also to like, do my partners know what's going on and how and which and when I need to go and get tested, again, to get my prescription for PrEP, and or if I need to go and get my injectable shot, right? And then you have consent and communication. Am I going to switch from taking my PrEP on a daily basis because I have kept up with my regimen, or am I going to switch to 2-on-1 because maybe I'm a person that is not having as much sex all the time, and so I feel like I can take it in a space where I'm going to take it right before I know that I'm going to engage, and then I'll take it 24 hours after that, and then 48 hours after that last one, right? And then from there, experience, right? So what is my experience? And so for me, having peace in terms of how in which I navigate PrEP and my PrEP usage is essential and it's important, but everybody is different. And so I think that when we talk about pleasure and we talk about bringing PrEP into the conversation, it is erasing the stigma that like, oh, if you're taking PrEP, then you have HIV. But also too, it also allows for people to think about, what if I do come into contact with someone who has the virus? That doesn't mean that I cannot have any contact with them or I cannot engage with them, because actually I can, because me being on PrEP and them also potentially being on antiretroviral therapy or ART can allow us to still have a safe and sexy, healthy lifestyle.
Okay. I really, when you were talking about the toolkit, if you don't know, Eric and I create worksheets to go along with each episode. So I'm already thinking about how we can help people go through building what's in their sexual health toolkit. And I also love the idea of peace for sexual health in general. I love that you have it for PrEP specifically, but the whole thing is about having a peace of mind. And so being able to incorporate the acronym to create the toolkit, I think is brilliant. So thanks so much for introducing that.
I love that you also talked about like how with PrEP, it's pill form, it's an injectable. The 2-on-1 I think is also really important for people to know about, because I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to take this pill daily. and
people don't even want to take their vitamins
right.
every day, so their birth control every day. So what can we do to make it more
right.
make it easier for folks?
Yeah, so I really love like bringing that to the conversation. I think that is so important, and I think also adding in the peace of mind that you then have to be able to, you know that, hey, I'm protecting myself, right? And I think that's the piece around all of this, is that the piece that gives us peace is that, if we're able to really, do all the safer sex practices that we want to, we can have that peace of mind to access the pleasure that we want.
Yeah, to me, it goes back to what a lot of us want, which is control.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't want to feel like we are leaving our safety and our health in the hands of someone else.
Right.
And being able to know, these are the things in my toolkit, here are the medications that I'm taking, I know my status, all of these other things can make us feel safer, and that we are performing in our best interest.
Yeah. And then with that too, the last piece I want to say is also the piece around, having sexual relationships with people with, who are HIV positive and undetectable. I think is such a big piece too, because I think with PrEP, it helps also break down the stigma, right, around that, because unfortunately, a lot of people think, oh, well, if I'm with someone who has HIV, I'm going to get it, and, that's scary, and people are living full, productive, thriving, pleasurable lives with HIV. And so I think that PrEP is another way to really help other people recognize that this is just another aspect of life, that we shouldn't necessarily be demonizing other people around.
Great point, Eric.
Yeah.
And, PrEP is also predominantly seen as a medication that queer men use, and there's a lot of stigma historically and currently that looks at queer men and gay men specifically as being the ones most impacted by HIV, that leave a lot of folks feeling like they're not at risk, and so they don't think about protecting themselves from HIV as something to prioritize. But Mystique, you have a whole campaign called Black Women PrEP, and I would love for you to talk a little bit more about why it's important for everyone, including Black women, to talk about, be knowledgeable of, and have access to PrEP if they would like to.
Yes, absolutely. So essentially, I'll start with this statistic that 91% of new HIV infections are comprised from heterosexual contact. And so when we think about HIV as a virus, we often think about, oh, it is for men who have sex with men or queer people. But in reality, based on that statistic, we completely can say that that is only a portion of the picture if we're looking at it. And so of that 91%, approximately 57% of those new infections are Black women. And that is a really high number, given that Black women only make up about 47% of the US population. And so I don't know about you, but when I see numbers like that, I'm like, so how is it that our rate of transmission is higher than the actual overall population in the United States? And it is because we as a society have portrayed this idea that, oh, it couldn't be me. It's never going to be me because I don't fall into this category. But if we look even further into what it takes and how you can be a person that is living with HIV, we have to go back to the basic steps, which is essentially the CDC asks a specific question every time you go and get tested. They say, are you a person that has had sex with a man or a person with a penis in the last 5 years? So if you are a person with a vulva and you are having heterosexual sex, the answer is yes. And so if the CDC says this is what makes you eligible to take PrEP, then why are we not doing so? And so that is only one piece of it, but most people don't think of it like that, because just in the last year or so, we are now seeing commercials where it's not just cisgender, Eurocentric white men, right? or people who are presenting as men. We are now seeing a diverse panel of individuals coming and talking about their experiences and why they chose to be on PrEP, or talking about the other end of that, the retroactive, like, oh, I thought that I was exempt because that is what marketing told me, that is what, my doctors told me, but now I know that to be otherwise. And so essentially the campaign is really about building up the capacity for us to be really cognizant and intentional about how we speak up and hold space for ourselves and the things that we need in terms of our sexual health, and PrEP being one of those things that is very important.
Absolutely. I really love you being able to share all of that, especially the question of, have you had sex with someone with a penis in the past 5 years? That just tells us, like, well, almost everyone should be on PrEP then, right? Like,
I think there's still a lot of miseducation and shame to navigate when it comes to HIV and STIs in general. I'm even thinking of, back in the 70s and 80s, early 90s, people had an idea that you could only get HIV if you had a certain type of sex. Right. And so that was typically seen as anal sex. And so if you were in a heterosexual relationship and you were not having anal sex, it's like, well, I'm not at risk.
Right.
Of course, that has now changed and people are a lot more aware, but there is still some gaps in the education that lead people to this thing called hope and doubt and denial.
Right.
And, we can't always trust that people are being completely honest about their fidelity. And that's why it goes back to that piece of what is in my toolkit that I can say, I have control over this and I'm taking the steps necessary for me to have the peace of mind and to prioritize my safety without feeling like I'm putting it into the hands of someone else. I know we want to believe best intentions when it comes to the people that we are partnered with and creating lives with, but also, something else that happens, people don't get tested frequently. And so it's not always, oh, was this person unfaithful? It was, when's the last time they've been tested? And how long have you been in this relationship? When was their last relationship? Were they tested before then? And it can happen under those circumstances as well. So it's not always the malicious storyline. Sometimes it's just the miseducated and lack of prioritization when it comes to our sexual wellness, because we don't think or believe we fall into that category.
Something else I want to point out is about the ways in which that HIV can be transmitted. And so we talked a lot about sexual contact and what that looks like, but we would be remiss if we did not speak about drug injection, and that PrEP can also be a preventative measure to take if you are an individual who does use drugs, right? If you are a person who has a vulva and becomes pregnant, you can also take PrEP to prevent you from contracting the virus, as well as passing it on through your fetus if you come into contact with the virus while you are pregnant. And so these are things that we don't think about, but they do come up. And these are ways in which that we can, again, take the autonomy to be active in our sexual experience and staying safe.
It's all about, like we keep saying, it's about making sure that we have these resources to be able to have the sex that we want and the pleasure that we want. And, for me, I'm like, yeah, if we have all these things, going on, then I can just be in the moment and not be thinking about anything else but that moment of pleasure.
Yeah. I think oftentimes we talk about distractibility during sex, and sometimes it is about, oh, I have this meeting tomorrow, or are the kids gonna disrupt us at any moment? And other times it is about our safety and what are we doing to make sure that we don't get pregnant and all this other stuff.
So I feel like we've really run through quite a bit of information around safer sex, and I really appreciate the rich conversation we've had. But Mystique, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think final thoughts are, it is important to be confident and be courageous, but also be intentional about stepping up for yourself in terms of having safer sex.
I love that. Stepping up for yourself. I think really.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mystique, for that last tip. And before we let you go, we would love for you to share where people can learn more about you and the Black Women PrEP campaign.
Absolutely. So you can find me on all social media platforms as Mystkue. That is Mystque. And if you visit my website, www.mystique.com/BWP2, that is where you'll find all the information about Black Women PrEP 2 and all the things that we are doing.
Thank you. And of course, we will be sure to provide links for folks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, and let's go to our next break.
All right. See y'all in a bit. And we're back with our second guest, Molly Pearson. Molly's work centers around sex, identity, aging, illness, community, and the risk we take to survive and make life worth living. They have been deeply involved in local and state-based efforts towards queer liberation, HIV, and sex work decriminalization, and queer aging advocacy. As a freelance consultant and educator, they have coached emerging sex work advocates, provided technical assistance to ensure Missouri's state plan on aging is inclusive of the needs of LGBTQ older adults, and has trained hundreds of aging care providers on the provisions required under New Jersey's LGBTQ Senior Bill of Rights. They have also developed original training content for a variety of organizations on a range of topics, including how to support the sexual pleasure of older adults living with HIV, harm reduction principles, the social work code of ethics, and more. They are also a member of What Would an HIV Doula Do? Collective, a community of people joined in response to the ongoing AIDS crisis, and their writing can be found at Catapult, The Body, Out in STL, The New Territory, and elsewhere. Welcome to the pod, Molly.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's so exciting to be here. I adore you both. So being able to just sit and chat with you is great.
I know. I'm very much so looking forward to that, too.
I loved learning more things about you. That's awesome. Can't wait to dive in.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun time. So starting off with my fun question. We've already done this once, but would love to hear what is one aspect of safer sex you've heard that made it super duper extra sexy.
Ooh, one aspect of safer sex. Okay, so there's this song, and maybe you can like link to it in the show notes or something. I don't know. There's this song that I grew up with. So I was raised in a queer household, with like drag queens running around all the time. And during rehearsals for drag shows, my dad and these two cis women who were also drag queens performed this song and rehearsed it over and over and over. And it's called You Suck by a band called Consolidated featuring the Yeasty Girls. And it is this raunchy, deliciously dirty song all about cunnilingus, and it leads with pleasure. It leads with these women naming very explicitly what they want from their partners, and then halfway through the song they have a verse about HIV prevention. But the way they do it, it's like the discussion, like in the song, the lyrics, the discussion of safer sex and pleasure are not two separate discussions. It's all one continuous song.
Wow.
And so if we think about like, it doesn't have to be, okay, we talk about the safer sex stuff and then we talk about the pleasurable stuff. Like, no, it can be all the same. And so this song that I heard playing in like my living room with drag queens rehearsing to it over and over and over, like I will remember the lyrics to this song for the rest of my life. And it was just such an amazing example of just being unapologetic about the important, serious stuff, and also the fun and hilarious and sexy stuff. And it's all the same. It's not one or the other. It's both all of the time in an ongoing conversation. So I think that is maybe like this particular song just like I think does a really amazing job of illustrating that it's not one or the other, it's all of it all together.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds awesome. I'm definitely gonna look it up and check it out because I'm like, oh, I wanna hear this dope sounding song.
I want to be empowered. To ask for what I want.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I definitely really enjoyed not just the song itself, but also the story behind it. That just sounds really cool space to grow up in, and I'm jealous. I wish I had drag queens running around my house growing up. Oh man. Okay, so we love to do some ground setting. So let's start with maybe you sharing with us about like how you got into the work that you've done around prevention, but also pleasure, and what that journey has looked like.
Yeah, so I actually don't do a lot of work around prevention. I think that there are a lot of people who do a great job at that work. I'm actually more interested in actually centering people who are living with STIs, who didn't prevent transmission, and of whatever STI we're talking about, and really honoring and respecting people's full humanity and rejecting healthism. A large part of that has to do with the way I was raised, which I just alluded to. But my household was very directly impacted by the AIDS crisis, the ongoing AIDS crisis. And one thing that I see a lot in sex education spaces, not just like the kind of backwards, antiquated abstinence only or abstinence plus, which is like abstinence education plus a little bit of information on STIs. Not only in those spaces, but even in explicitly sex positive spaces, we often frame prevention as like a virtue and as something to constantly be striving for. And of course, like nobody wants to get sick. Nobody wants to contract a bacterial infection or a virus. Like those are things that we naturally avoid. And at the same time, we are all living in a body, and that means that we live in a semi-permeable membrane. Like bodies are fluid and we are always interacting with our environments all around us. And so I have maybe the unpopular opinion that our prevention paradigm is sort of the new abstinence. It's sort of a new virtue signal. It's sort of a thing that is wielded in sex positive spaces that really erases people who are living with STIs. When we assume in our sex education practice that everyone we're talking to is STI negative by default, we're leaving out millions of people who that is not their lived experience. And so thinking about who we're erasing, who we're centering, who we're ignoring, and whose boundaries we're ignoring, we often fail to take seriously the boundaries and needs of people living with STIs. And so I'm really interested in making sure that we're including everyone in pleasure, and not just assuming that the only people who deserve pleasure are the people who are constantly preventing STI transmission.
Wow. Molly, I just love that approach because there's also so much self-righteousness sometimes within those conversations that make pleasure and sex and exploration really inaccessible, or it kind of makes you feel shameful, and you start having some inner criticism that limits your experience to sexuality because of how people may judge you. And I don't know if it's off base, but with COVID. And how often it was kind of touted like, I don't have COVID, or how often I test, or just like the precautions people would take that would really box people in and make people hide. Like they were scared to disclose if they were vaccinated or not, or just overall what their wellness status was. And it really reminded me about the way that we talk about STIs and prevention. And it doesn't help us, right? Yeah. It just makes us stay silent or hide ourselves or not disclose and just not have the conversations that we need to have because of the fear that's starting to be placed inside of it. Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think also something that we really easily forget is that we receive our test results and negative. We're STI free. Mm-hmm. I think we forget a lot of the time that if we are sexually active and we receive those test results, that result is only reflective of the moment you were tested.
Right.
And so I think we get this false sense of security or invincibility, like, oh, all clean, right? We see the word clean a lot, especially on hookup apps. And so
don't get me started.
Especially on gay hookup apps in particular. And so thinking about like how that impacts the mental well-being of people who do know they have an STI, it's just this narrative and this sort of knee-jerk reaction, like, oh, I'm good to go, all set, I'm a good one. And it's really, really harmful, and gives us a false sense of security and a false sense of reality, I think, too.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you bringing up the word clean. The number of times where I've had, people who I'm talking to on hookup apps and they're being like, are you clean? And I'm just like, what do you mean by that? Like, you tell me what that word means to you. And 9 times out of 10, it's, well, are you HIV, STI negative? And I'm like, we'll say that because the implication is that those who are not, or who are, who do have an STI or HIV are dirty. Which goes back to this idea that, the prevention piece is this higher moral grounding that we're somehow better than or clean than others who are not. And that's, it's a very gross feeling.
I'm just thinking of how, I'm wondering where that really came from. And I'm wondering if it's like, you have a clean bill of health, in terms of going to your doctor and getting all of your exams and your lab results, and how if it's a derivative of that, and then how it's now associated with dirtiness and negativity.
Absolutely. And I think class too, like access to healthcare is not a guarantee in this country. And, if you look at like social determinants of health, and like, we really prize, being fully able-bodied, being healthy, being, this strapping, healthy, full of vitality person moving through the world, right? And that's like a symptom of capitalism and colonization and purity culture and all of those things that value certain bodies far more than others. And so I think it's a really easy trap to fall into, especially when we're trying to like advance this discussion of like sex positivity and like normalize sex, make people not afraid of sex. And so in that process, we also sanitize what it means to be sexually active. And we can kind of present this facade of, if it feels good, do it, and you only have to worry about yourself. Set your boundaries, set your boundaries, name your needs. And I think we often fail to remember that sex is relational. And I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, that, to be in a body means to be in a semi-permeable membrane. And so if we are obsessed with putting our needs first, our boundaries, we fail to remember that other people may have other needs, may have other boundaries. And so really remembering that it's all relational, even our physical health is relational, and it's a product of our social conditioning, it's a product of our institutions, it's a product of privilege and oppression, all of those things. And STIs are just as much caught up in all of those things as any other health condition. But we often just we think of STIs as something other or separate when it's really not. It's just as caught up in all of these narratives and institutions, just like everything else is.
Yeah, it kind of puts the responsibility only on the individual instead of looking at all the other components surrounding that person's lived experience, their access to care, from education to finances to family beliefs that curate or inhibit them from prioritizing their sexual health and wellness. There's so many factors that I think it's easy for us as a society to say, oh, it's your fault, you're bad, you're dirty, you're not prepared, you're irresponsible, instead of saying your sex education is terrible, no one has ever talked to you about sex, all these other, factors that play a role into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Rafaela, you really nail it with like individualism. Like even in our, radically sex positive discourse, we can fall into that trap of American hyper individualism. And I want to see more community care in sex education discourse for sure.
What would that look like?
Yeah.
What are some ideas that are in your head when you think about that? Or as you say that, give us some images.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm specifically thinking of a scholar and researcher and activist based out of Canada named Alexander McClelland. And he wrote this incredible essay a few years ago called Unprepared. And he talks about in this piece, as a gay man living with HIV, and how PrEP, the advent of PrEP, right? A once daily pill that you can take to prevent HIV transmission, right? Scientifically speaking, revolutionary, incredible medical breakthrough.
Yeah.
And through this essay, he talks about how, yes, there's this great drug that's available to people. And when people are taking it, often it kills the conversation. It kills any sense of community care. It doesn't open up conversation for needs, wants, boundaries, desires. It reduces the interaction to, like, when he discloses, he talks about like he discloses that he's positive, undetectable. And so often the response that he will get is, oh, it's okay, I'm on PrEP. So it's like, I don't care that you're living with HIV. I'm on PrEP. I'm protected. I don't want to hear about your experience. And his whole point is like, well, no, like the politics of disclosure are not neutral. You're telling me you don't care. Oh, it's all good. I'm on PrEP. Well, no, like we need to have a larger conversation. And just shutting down any kind of engagement or relationality in a sexual encounter. And so I think when it comes to community care and like hookup culture and apps and everything, I think that we can practice deep reverence and care for one another, even in a very casual hookup scenario. Like, I really believe it is possible to have casual sex and still give a shit about the person that we are fucking. And I think that we get in this narrative of like, oh, it's just a casual thing. Like, they don't matter. No, they do. And I think that we can bring a really different energy to how we engage with one another and practice vulnerability, practice these conversations, even when our goal is like to just get off and not actually like have a long-term relationship. So I think bringing curiosity to encounters, I think talking about sex when we are not actually having sex, right? Like engaging in what sex means to us, what it is we're looking to experience from sex, thinking about all of these things even and especially when we're not actually having it, I think is so, so, so important.
What you shared about McClellan's piece is so powerful, and I'm so happy to hear about that, because it really is so insightful and heartbreaking, where someone is essentially erased in a very vulnerable moment. So often we talk about the vulnerability that comes with being in closed spaces, being nude and in closed spaces with others, getting ready to share your body with someone, and then in a split second, someone saying, I'm only here for one thing. I don't care about what you have going on outside of this, is really heartbreaking, and I think highlights the way that people treat sex in general. It's just, again, what can I get out of this experience as soon as possible, maybe, and so long, never hope to see you again. And it just speaks more loudly to the conversations we should definitely be having around sexual citizenship and care between ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we have to reserve that for our long-term relationships, or long-term sexual relationships too. So I'm really interested to read that piece as well. And we do have a podcast episode coming up where we're going to be talking about casual sex, and so
absolutely,
we'll have more space to dive into that a little bit more.
And I think the other piece I was thinking of around that too is our other guest is Mystique on this episode, and she talked about PrEP for particularly Black women, which we know, have a really high rate of HIV infection. And when we were talking about it, we were talking about how PrEP can be this space to have a different conversation around sex and around, those who are HIV positive and undetectable and all that. But I think in that conversation, I think I was a little naive of like forgetting that also is another reality for people, right? Of very much so of, oh, I don't care, right? Like I'm on this thing that protects me, so I don't have to think about you in this way anymore, right? I don't have to be considerate of you. And so something that could be looked at as a great way to open up conversation can also then be a way to stop the conversation altogether. And so I'm really appreciative of that added piece.
And I also think that it's dismissive in a protective way, if that makes sense. I'm going to try to explain it, where maybe not all the time it's not, oh, I protect myself, I don't care. It could be, it's not a big deal. Like, don't worry about it because of all the shame and judgment that people typically experience if and when they disclose. So it can be used in like that type of way, which is also doesn't feel good either, because I'm not ashamed of my lived experience, and I want to share it with you. But now I'm being shut out in this way that feels like, oh, I'm trying to save you the embarrassment.
Yeah, and I love, Rafaela, just now you use the phrase if and when someone discloses. I think the politics of disclosure is so important to take seriously. A lot of people go through life believing, I am owed unconditional disclosure from all partners. But again, we are only STI negative at the moment that we were tested.
Yes.
And also, we fail to think about the weight and the seriousness of backlash, even violence, even criminalization that can come with disclosure.
Yeah.
And I think of a specific incident just a few months ago, and I'm going to choose my words very carefully and not name any names, but someone reached out to me, and they're super involved in like DIY, radical leftist organizing and communities, and very much a part of a scene where, community care is centered, anti-ableism, all these things. And it came out that someone in this very tight-knit, leftist community had slept with someone who was HIV positive, and they didn't disclose because their viral load was undetectable. And so they were like, well, there's not really a lot to talk about. At least that was the choice that they made in that moment. And when the person did find out that this person that they had slept with was positive, they flew into a rage and called this person out on social media and basically revealed their status without their permission and, revealed their private health information. That is the exact thing that prevents people from disclosing. That exact thing. And so I think a lot of folks expect unconditional disclosure, but then fail to think seriously about treating someone who does disclose with care and reverence and curiosity. And so I think it's just a really, really vicious cycle, particularly for folks with incurable or long-term STIs. I mean, there's the saying, stigma kills. Like HIV is treatable. Herpes is treatable. You live with it forever, yes, but it's a treatable chronic condition,
right?
Like anything else. It's the stigma that really pulls people apart and pulls people away. And it's stigma that keeps people living in secret. And I think sometimes, even among the most sex positive spaces, we can fall into that trap of inadvertently or accidentally upholding stigma by not really talking about disclosure politics.
And, to be honest, we don't have the skills for that. A lot of us don't have the skills to do that. I'm thinking about how many of us have grown up in households where a parent says, tell me the truth and it'll be fine, and then we tell the truth and it's not fine, and they become violent or they punish us in some way. How many times do we tell our partners to just be honest, but then we punish them in some way? And so to me, it's very cyclical and telling that, people respond poorly because they have not had the skills to learn. And we need to also continue talking about what does it mean to have conversation outside of use. I love an I statement, right? I love all of these skills.
Yeah.
But it's usually geared towards the person who wants to share information, and not how are we also teaching people how to receive information, how to listen, how to be a safe space. We're asking people to be vulnerable and take risks, and we put it all on them without saying, okay, now how can you make it okay for me to take risk and be vulnerable? We're not having that conversation enough. So it makes sense to me that people blow up because that's what they've been shown or that's what they've experienced themselves. And we really have to teach them that that's not okay, that they also deserved better when they disclosed something and trusted someone. And let's get this right because we can do better than that.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, I am not anti-prevention, right? I am not anti-PrEP. I am like, yes, use condoms, use dental dams, pull out method. If what it is you're trying to prevent is pregnancy in this case, do all the things that you want and need to do. But I think at the end of the day, like, thinking beyond your own needs, I think is something that is just so, so, so important. Remembering that other people have needs too, and they might be different than your own. So how can you work together to reach compromise? Like, really reach a compromise, really have open conversations that maybe push your comfort levels a little bit, or make you have to sit back and think. Or maybe the result of the conversation is, maybe we shouldn't sleep with each other. That's okay too. And I think you're so right, Rafaela. Like, we are not in a culture that prioritizes that or celebrates that or teaches that. And I think that there's just so much that we could be infusing more into sex education efforts and curriculum and discourse that would really just really better grapple with these sticky spots that aren't so cut and dry, that don't fit easily into, like, an Instagram infographic,
Yeah. Sex Ed 101.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and maybe talk a bit more about the sex education piece, because I'm definitely curious to have y'all's thoughts. Okay. And we're back. So we were just talking about, different ways we can look at how sex ed is really delivered, particularly around this context of, for me, I think of it like a more relational aspect of sexuality. And so I'm really wondering, like, what are some of those pieces that we can start to rethink, even when it comes to, like you said, even with comprehensive sex ed, there's still this piece around prevention. There's still these ideas that can still be really limiting in how we can reach this goal of sexual liberation for all people. That was like our first episode. That's why I'm like chuckling a little. And I think this plays a big part into that too.
Yeah, because then is sexual liberation only available to folks who are STI negative?
Right.
Yeah, so which is the answer is no. The answer is that everyone sorry, I left that lingering a little bit. Everyone can be and deserves sexual liberation.
Yeah. Well, I think, going back to what a lot of us cognitively know, or like we believe that sexual liberation is intertwined with all areas of liberation, right? Like sexual liberation is racial justice. It is economic justice. It's like our liberation is bound together across experiences and identities. And I think what's tricky about sex is that we so often think of it as something separate and something so deeply individualized and personal that we can think of it as like a personal issue. Even when we say like, oh, sexual liberation is a justice issue. It's a, it's a social justice arena. Yes. And I think we could just do a lot better job of acting like it. Like even when we're not having sex. And so thinking about how our sex education curriculum, or the sex education that we're fighting for, right? Because a lot of sex education curriculum is severely lacking across this country.
Right.
But I think in the process of advocating for better curriculum for all across all ages, that we're not glossing over the hard stuff. Like in our efforts to combat regressive abstinence only education, the answer is not like a knee-jerk response to say, okay, well then we just need the opposite, pleasure, 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 and that's it. No, we need to grapple with pleasure and take pleasure seriously. And we also have to take seriously bodies and the reality of living in a body and healthism and how we honor all kinds of lived realities and think critically about the things we mentioned earlier: access to healthcare, access to education, the culture we live in, all of these things. And so I think with sex education, not losing sight of that. It's not that we just want to like, in our efforts to make such education better, we're not like, oh, everything's fine, everything's great, pleasure only. Like that we really sit with those sticky spots, those spots that are difficult for us to navigate, and trusting that young people especially want to talk about it, right? They can handle it. They really can. And I think trusting that and believing that, I think is really, really important.
I really appreciate that. That actually made me think of this workshop that I did a few years ago at my previous job, where I was really looking at the idea of sex positivity and how that can also be really limiting, right? Like when we only think of it in this way of like, again, right, pleasure, 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 sex positive, all these things, it can really leave us not be able to be critical of that sexuality as well, right? It doesn't lend itself for us to really interrogate what it is that's going on and what people are experiencing to get to this place where people can, have that idea of like sexual liberation, that we can all get to liberation, that it just, again, kind of has this watered down effect where we're not looking at the full picture. And so I really appreciate that piece, because I think that's so true of, if there's only one way we're looking at it, we're still missing things. And so how can we really integrate it so that it's more holistic and that it's looking at the good, the bad, the ugly, because it's all valid.
Yeah. But I do believe that pleasure leads to liberation. I just think that we get stuck when it's only one form of pleasure, when you're hyper focused on sexual pleasure and you're not creating this narrative that, oh, even in situations where we are in conflict but we get to resolution, like that's pleasure too, because we're connecting, we're understanding one another. It doesn't have to be sexual pleasure leads to sexual liberation. It's pleasure helps us know ourselves, build community, validate other people's lived experiences, and create those encounters, thus communities and worlds that we want to live in and be in. So
yeah, absolutely. And what you just said, Rafaela, reminds me of the work that we do in What Would an HIV Doula Do? So we are an interdisciplinary group of people that are joined in a response to the ongoing AIDS crisis. And as a collective, we believe that no one contracts HIV alone, so no one should have to deal with it alone. And I think what you're saying, Rafaela, of like not just sexual pleasure, but pleasure of all forms, and the pleasure of working through disagreement, the pleasure of really seeing another person and responding to that person in a real and genuine way. I think those skills are just as vital as sexual pleasure. And I think a lot of those things are transferable. Like the communication skills that we can practice when we're having sex with each other can also be practiced just in our day-to-day lives with the people that we're not having sex with.
yeah, it's hard though, because, you know, we were raised to be seen and not heard, stay in our place in line, not be different but not too different. You know, it's like all these different things that we have to unbox ourselves from and find ourselves. And so, you know, we're saying this in a way, as I'm imagining maybe three of us have done different types of internal work and community work, but for other people who may be listening and maybe like, what the heck are you even talking about? Like, how do you start? It's so hard. I have my trauma, which right still sneaks up on me.
Yeah.
But it's this belief that I have that I can do better, that we can do better, that I really try to ground myself within and just hold myself accountable and apologize when I need to, repair as a practice, not as a what if. Like, no, I will mess up.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm building community where we expect that and we're working on how to do it better because we can, you know. And then maybe one day it'll just, my thought is like, if I do it and model it and build community, then everyone, what is it? Reach one, teach one, reach one. And it just expands, like, then everyone is better. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like a long shot, but it doesn't hurt to try on my short time on this earth.
But some other educators out there that I really want to shout out that do incredible work around STIs and politics of disclosure and all of it. Courtney Brame, with Something Positive for Positive People. That talk about like holding space for, you know, transition, right? Because that's what doula-ing as a verb really is like holding space for someone during a transition, when whether we're talking about a birth doula or a death doula or a gender doula or an HIV doula. Courtney Brame, just the work that he does, I don't think he defines himself as a doula, but I see him doing it in his deep work with people who are grappling with disclosing their positive herpes status to partners. And he posts like anonymous screenshots of text exchanges he has with people that he works with, and like the joy that comes when people are fully seen and heard when they share this part of themselves. And I think he is doing just such important work to change the conversation. And one thing that he talks a lot about is not STI prevention, but STI minimization. Because STIs will be exchanged. They will. Like, that's how viruses work, that's how bacteria works, that's how bodies work.
That's how
And
life
so
works.
Yeah.
yeah, how life works. And so what happens when we shift that focus from prevention, aka purity, to minimization? How can we reduce harm? How can we, of course, minimize the transmission of STIs, but not delude ourselves into thinking that we can just avoid them altogether and just
Right.
like, if we don't pay attention to it, they'll just go away. And that's, I mean, we know that's not true. Um, and so I think he's just doing such incredible work. And then another person that I want to shout out who has really been on hiatus for a while. They haven't posted in a long time, but their archive that's available is just so wonderful. They write anonymously under the pseudonym Stimulation. So on Instagram, it's like at symbol STI dot mulation. So like it spells stimulation, but STI is highlighted.
Yeah.
And they have an archive of Substack posts about what happens when we center STI positive people in sex education discourse. What does health even mean? Like, literally, what does it mean? Like, what is health? How are we defining it? Who is defining it? Who gets to decide? But those are two, I think, really innovative educators working in the STI space that I think are just doing such invaluable work without apology, and they're doing what needs to be done.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah.
I really love the introduction or reminder about harm reduction. I think harm reduction theory, practices, and policy can take us such a far way in so many different realms. And typically people are introduced to it when it comes to substance use and things like that. But I feel like it can be applied to everything.
It really, really can. And I mean, there's no fixed definition of harm reduction, but one way that I like to think of it is minimizing harm while maximizing pleasure. So if you can take that as a guidepost in your negotiations with a partner, in your way of relating to one another, how do we minimize harm and maximize pleasure? And I think that that is a way to still celebrate and center pleasure and having more of it, while also, being real and not turning away from the things that scare us or the things that are stigmatized. Like, we can hold it all. And I think that that can be a really helpful framework.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. So we've come to the end, but we would love to have you share any final thoughts with us and our listeners.
It's February.
Yes.
And that means it's Black History Month. That means we have Valentine's Day. It means we have my birthday. My birthday is on Sunday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. But February is also Love Positive Women Month. Love Positive Women was an initiative started by a woman living with HIV named Jessica Whitbread. It is now an international celebration of women living with HIV specifically. And just beautiful, joyful, pleasure-based celebrations of HIV positive women. And so they're on Instagram. There are events that happen all over. And so I think that's another thing that we can do, is to not just say like, oh, okay, like let's think about the politics of disclosure and think about, these hard conversations and relationality. We can also like just have fun. And I think Love Positive Women is a really great way to think about, we all benefit so much from people living with HIV and STIs, and we may not even know it, right? So remembering the full humanity of people living with HIV and STIs is so important. And I think Love Positive Women is just such a beautiful, beautiful example of like how to do that in action.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Truly, we really appreciate you, Molly, for joining us and giving us just all these wonderful nuggets. All right, listeners. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did, please like and subscribe to the Soft Landing Podcast, a gentle space for self-discovery. We are at Soft Landing on Instagram. Thank you. And then you can also go to Healing Exchange. That's xchg.com and /podcast to find all of our wonderful show notes, worksheets, transcripts, all that stuff.
And to submit a question.
Yes. Please give us your questions. We would love to discuss them on the pod. And then also, excitingly, next week we will talk about BDSM and kink. So buckle up for that one. Or strap in. Yeah.
Clever.
Yeah.
All right, Molly. Well, again, thank you so much for choosing to be here with us and have this conversation and being able to talk about prevention, pleasure, and dreaming with us what a more loving community and world could look like.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. This was so much fun.
All right, everyone. Bye.
Bye.